Okay, good morning. I am reading from White Reconstruction, Domestic Warfare and the Logics of Genocide by Dylan Rodríguez. We're going to be reading the first 17 pages of the introduction, and we'll continue after that. Introduction. The causes of the effect, inhabiting White Reconstruction. Before Beyond, November 2016. One small note, I guess it is my intention when I run across difficult conceptual pieces to make a separate video and embed a link into this one so that we can take a pause and interrogate ontology. We are in the fray of yet another moment in the long history of the United States as a project of anti-blackness and racial colonial violence. The ascendance of white nationalism, white supremacist terrorism, and white fascist statecraft prior to, during, and beyond the election of Donald Trump has authorized a proliferation of racist, misogynistic, and transphobic state and extra-state terror. When I began working on this book in the late 2000s, few imagined and far fewer anticipated the intense aggregation of reaction against the neoliberal post-racial hope of post-civil rights, post-racial humanism crystallized in the symbolic and institutional matter of the Obama presidency. As I write this introduction a decade later, a complex totality of cultural institutional movements actively imagine, publicly advocate, and openly plan the neutralization and extermination of black people. Invasive and degrading enforcement of gender and sexual normativity, cultural and ecological genocide of indigenous peoples, focused militarization against the border crossers from Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, and other forms of tactical and strategic infrastructure building that instead extend the epical delusions shaping what Sylvia Wynter references as techno-industrial progress and national racial manifest destiny, aka civilization, a term I will capitalize throughout this book when referencing the ongoing half-millennium of hemispheric conquest. It should be clear by now that whatever stubborn social historical antagonisms that the alleged post-racial society was projected to displace or eliminate may have been inadequately conceptualized or improperly defined. White Reconstruction is a response to some of these urgent critical failures. This book is animated by an archive of radical thinkers whose work facilitates a critical re-engagement with a number of concepts and keywords. Racism, white supremacy, multiculturalism, mass incarceration, genocide, and so on, while also nourishing the development of some alternative terms reintroduced and used throughout this book, including white being, multiculturalist white supremacy, genocide poetics, and domestic war. I rely on a combination of analytical, archival, and theoretical methods that are expressed in different traditions of creative and radical praxis, from 20th century anti-colonialism and black feminist radicalism to 21st century abolitionism and indigenous anti-colonialism and decolonization. White Reconstruction focuses on the conditions of possibility for the most recent and current revivals and rearticulation of white being's ascendancy, and offers a frame through which to understand how these mobilizations shape, strengthen, and sustain the foundational regimes of anti-blackness and racial colonial violence that constitute the contemporary United States and its globality, from the scales of the systemic to the intimately interpersonal. Throughout the study, I posit anti-blackness and racial colonial power as distinct, though significantly coterminous, and often symbiotic formations of dominance that constitutes the conditions of sociality, state formation, epistemic and ontological coherence, and economic and ecological sustainability within the long hemispheric projects of civilization, conquest, statement, and modernity. Wanted to look up how to pronounce that name. João Costa Vargas and Moon Ki Jung's definition of anti-blackness as structured, ubiquitous, and perjuring disadvantages for black people and structured advantages for non-blacks. In the realms of ontology, that is, how individuals constitute and define themselves as such, sociability, that is, lived social experience, and access to resources. The likelihood of social and physical death is a direct function of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness in this conceptualization is the systemic and aesthetic, ontological, and political condition of colonial, chattel, and modern societies, and not merely a secondary expression or consequence of otherwise non-anti-Black social formations. To the extent that anti-Blackness constitutes sociality as such, it also tends to serve as the assumptive, under-theorized premise for counter-hegemonic, reformist, radical, and even revolutionary struggles against the oppressive, exploitative, and fatal power institutionalities of civilization. That is, anti-Blackness may be fortified and reproduced by such struggles, even as they aspire toward new forms of freedom and being. The notion of racial colonial power and violence draws from the thought of Haunani K. Trask, Kanaka Maoli, and Frantz Fanon, among others. In our subjugation to American control, we have suffered what other displaced, dislocated people, such as the Palestinians and Irish of Northern Ireland, have suffered. We have been occupied by a colonial power whose very law, policy, cultural institution, and collective behavior entrench foreign ways of life in our land and on our people. From the banning of our language and the theft of our sovereignty to forcible territorial incorporation in 1959, we have lived as subordinated native people in our ancestral home. A singularity of the colonial context lies in the fact that economic reality, inequality, and enormous disparities in lifestyles never managed to mask the human reality. Looking at the immediacies of the colonial context, it is clear that what divides this world is first and foremost what species, what race one belongs to. This book rests on the premise that racial colonial power and anti-Blackness, in their state-organized and extra-state forms, are aggressive, long historical violations of intimacy across forms of kinship, spirituality, community, and collective bodily integrity. The fray at hand reflects an extended asymmetrical hemispheric conflict that has been historically cultivated by the colonial and carceral practices of civilizational dominance that continuously fabricate new modalities of white self-vindication. This cultivation of declared, undeclared, and culturally normalized asymmetric warfare generally posits all other forms of being, human and otherwise, as actual or potential targets of domestication, expropriation, liquidation, occupation, coerced assimilation, and generalized subjugation to white beings' symbolic, economic, biological, epistemic, scientific, and cultural ascendancy. Thus, the notion of white reconstruction does not attempt to give title to a compartmentalized, exceptional moment of white supremacist rejuvenations. Rather, it references a historical, persistent, continuous, and periodically acute logic of reform, rearticulation, adaptation, and revitalization that shapes white social and ontological self and world-making within the aspirational, present tense, and violently future-oriented humanist projects of civilization, manifest destiny, progress, and so on. White Reconstruction crystallizes and mobilizes this logic through an ensemble of cultural and political projects, narrative structures, ideological tendencies, state formations that rely on, while actively reproducing, the distinct and dense national, hemispheric, and global violences of anti-Blackness and racial colonial power. While white Reconstruction neither began nor culminated in the electoral events of November 2016, and although its logics of antisocial formation are inseparable from the long emergence of a hemispheric and global white supremacist modernity, it is nonetheless possible to identify its period-specific intensities. In this sense, the term White Reconstruction also provides an alternative conceptualization and naming of the long half-century that is commonly referenced as the post-civil rights period. In fact, it was precisely such a renaming and rethinking that the late black radical scholar Clyde Woods had in mind when he encouraged the development of this project. Robert Allen's post-civil rights re-narrative. As longtime black scholar editor Robert Allen recounts in his classic study, Black Awakening in Capitalist America, the decade following the official abolition of U.S. apartheid, landmarked by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was characterized by a comprehensive institutional struggle to reconfigure and sustain white supremacy in the context of an anti-black colonial social formation in crisis. For Allen, the struggle for white supremacist reconfiguration and sustainability was galvanized by coalescence between state and extra-state, as philanthropic, corporate, and other private actors, to maintain between state and extra-state, philanthropic, corporate, and other private actors, the mandate to refurbish, reinvent, and strategically amplify the political and social repression of black radicalism and other forms of insurgent black life. Throughout this period, and of course well prior to it, black people within and beyond their various and complex forms of liberation struggle exemplified multiple models of self-determination and human being that potentially abolished the ascendancy of white human being, while also resonating with and often emboldening other oppressed people's revolutionary, anti-colonial, decolonial imaginaries. Allen's book documents and rigorously analyzes how a confluence of institutional mobilizations led by an ensemble of America's corporate elite, including the Ford Foundation, Urban Coalition, National Alliance of Businessmen, Carnegie Foundation, and Rockefeller Foundation, responded to the U.S. and diasporic black-led revolt that flourished in the 1960s and early 70s. Writing with a sense of alarmed urgency, Allen says, "In the United States today, a program of domestic neocolonialism is rapidly advancing. This program was formulated by America's corporate elite because they believe that urban revolts pose a serious threat to economic and social stability." I mean, potentially the point, but all right. Black Awakening provides a durable, indispensable examination of militarized and counter-insurgent racist state busily reforming its criminalization, policing, and carceral infrastructures in order to broaden its cultural and juridical capacities to wage domestic war. The brilliance of Allen's insight is his focus on the somewhat less conspicuous, though equally calculated, strategies of white humanitarianism and philanthropy that were simultaneously producing the ideological and institutional blueprint for an embryonic U.S. nonprofit industrial complex. This generally coordinated confluence of strategic planning across corporate, state, and civil society institutions was not only, quote, designed to counter the potentially revolutionary thrust of the recent black rebellions in major cities across the country, end quote, but was also a defense of the integrity of white being in and of itself, at a historical conjuncture in which its hemispheric ascendancy was destabilized by the successful overthrow of Jim Crow apartheid social form. To the extent that the ascendancy of white being composes the foundational grammars for white modernity's symbolic, cultural, economic, and epistemic coherence under the teleologies of civilization and progress, Allen's text clarifies the scale, intensity, and ambition of reconstructive labor that emerges among an ensemble of groups and organizations when white being is pushed into momentary retreat. Thus, alongside the socially transformative possibilities of creative black political and cultural productions that composed what Nikki Giovanni and Manning Marable referenced as the United States Second Reconstruction from 1945 to 2006, there has been an equally protracted, overlapping series of struggles to counteract, neutralize, and or liquidate liberation-oriented, feminist, queer, anti-colonial, decolonial, black radical, and anti-racist mobilizations of thought, organization, creative community, and collective self-defensive rebellion throughout the still ongoing post-civil rights moment. Black Awakening lucidly narrates how the organic intellectuals and professional planners of white civil society and the U.S. racist state scrambled through the 1970s to convene their collective political and economic capital, shared interests, and infrastructural capacities to countervail and co-opt the revolutionary social trajectories incited by the dense liberationist movements that posed imminent and direct threats to the dominance of global U.S. modernity and its foundational ordering in the ascendancy of white being. Put another way, Allen illustrates how the struggle to remake white being in the throes of the post-apartheid social juridical crisis, including its iterations through institutional mandates of multiculturalism, diversity, and inclusivity, affirm rather than undermine the totality of anti-blackness. The crucial soft directive became central to the institutional and political methods of white reconstruction during this period. Liberal and progressive blocs within the racist state and white civil society had to clearly delineate the horizons of post-apartheid political reforms in a manner that reproduced white being's ascendancy, while desegregating its institutional, phenotypic, and ideological expressions. The liberal progressive tendencies of the racist state and white civil society were tasked with cultivating a desegregated American dream that was ideologically inclusive of black and non-white masses, while simultaneously re-articulating, diversifying, and strengthening the logics of anti-blackness and racial colonial dominance on which that dream was and is based. Principal to this directive was the reproduction of racial capitalism and its constitutive violence, an agenda significantly accomplished through programs of class and cultural assimilation that have since taken the form of diversity and affirmative action programs, foundation and nonprofit funded campaigns for piecemeal policy reform, and delimited versions of social change, and various privately and publicly funded academic research grants, scholarships, and high-profile fellowships. By way of prominent example, the Ford Foundation played a central role in shaping the development of college and university-based African American Studies and Ethnic Studies programs, departments, and initiatives such that these institutionalizations help neutralize Black and Third World student protest while containing the epistemological and pedagogical implications of Black radicalism's epistemological and scholarly interventions. Similarly, liberal shifts in K-12 and college curricula, periodic piecemeal reforms of racist state policing, criminological, carceral practices, and hundreds of successful local, statewide, and national electoral campaigns for public office contributed to a disciplining of political imaginaries that established the framework for white reconstruction as an emergent political, cultural, and racial capitalist project. I offer this short meditation on the durable insights of Black Awakening in capitalist America to signify how a body of Black radical scholarship and activist study has enabled the construction of this book's primary thesis, that the ascendancy of white being toxifies the emergence, reproduction, and formal disassembly of American apartheid, that this ascendancy permeates the cultural politics and carceral statecraft of white liberalism and reaction alike, and that anti-blackness, racial colonial violence, and domestic war not only survive periods of reform, but are the relations of dominance on which such reforms rely and through which they often articulate. Dreadful Dream. White being, white supremacy, and the non-hegemonic. Over the course of the current half-century of White Reconstruction, the global U.S. racist state metastasizes with dooming brilliance as it invents, dismantles, and reproduces its changing protocols of immiseration and terror. Never quite reducible to the institutionalizations of white racial monopoly and American apartheid, the historical systems and infrastructures of gendered anti-blackness and racial colonial violence flex and reform at variable paces, from the incremental to the maddening. Mounting anecdotal and empirical evidence accrues, believable non-fictions of racist conspiracy buzzing beneath the coldly official accounts of black, brown, indigenous, and queer casualties, all of which indicate how desegregation, equal opportunity, diversity, tolerance, multiculturalism, colorblindness, and inclusion in the civilization experiment are the master's experiments, engineered to reproduce society structured in anti-black sociogeny and racial colonial dominance. There is a dream of reconstruction that recurs in the white social imaginary. This dream shapes and sharpens white nation building, while displaced and targeted peoples surge into labors of life-saving creativity. The insurgent peoples, whose collective personhood may itself be a primary method of rebellion, generally realize their liberation is an act of war, or at least a collective threat against the rising tide of white invitation into the experiment, as they simultaneously recognize there may be no outside to the promiscuous institutional reaches of a resurgent white reconstruction. Contrary to reductive, academic, journalistic, popular, cultural, and liberal progressive common sense formations of white supremacy as an exceptional, irrational, hateful, and or reactionary extremist political subjectivity, a rigorous definition of the term encompasses the deeply historical, normalized relations of gendered anti-blackness and racial colonial violence, evisceration, and denigration that have characterized the emergence of civilization and its coercive iterations of global modernity in the long post-conquest epoch. White supremacy is conceptualized in this book as a violence of aspiration and logic of social organization that invents, reproduces, revises, and transforms changing modalities of social dominance and systemic, targeted physiological and ecological violence. This domination and violation occurs through the planning, imagination, replanning, and institutionalization of group-based human and cultural hierarchies, spanning the environmental and economic to the epistemic and aesthetic. I distinguish the conceptualization of white supremacy from both anti-blackness and racial colonial power in the sense that the latter forms of dominance are not fundamentally aspirational, but are the long-existing pre-aspirational conditions through which white supremacy is made fathomable and coherent. White supremacy, as posited here, is animated by the dynamic narrations, global aspirations, and militarized mobilizations of white being. Guided by Sylvia Wynter's radical critique of European and Euro-American humanism, white being is the militarized normative paradigm of human being that inhabitants of the ongoing half-millennial civilizational project have involuntarily inherited as a violent universal. Wynter's framework rethinks the Marxist formulation of class struggle in the terms of a politics of being, that is, one waged over what is to be the descriptive statement of the human, about whose master code of symbolic life and death each human order organizes itself. End quote. White being as a narrative ceremonial practice of human being that pivots on relations of dominance with other beings, human and otherwise, and aspirational mastery over the wilderness and unknowabilities of nature and the physical universe should not be conflated wholesale with white people. Rather, it must be apprehended through its mobilizations. Lost my spot. Rather, it must be apprehended through its mobilizations of legitimated violence and colonial chattel entitlement that, in turn, build the historical apparati of white embodiment as active practices and institutionalizations of sociality. Fanon's surgically incisive meditation remains ever relevant. The epidermalized, physiologically activated structure of power that inheres in white bodies, however white bodies are sociopolitically formed and institutionalized in a given moment, is simultaneously the amplification and rewriting of politics, economy, and Eurocentric Marxist notions of substructure and mode of production. In continuity with the previously cited passage from The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon writes, "This compartmentalized world, this world divided in two, is inhabited by different species. In the colonies, the economic infrastructure is also a superstructure. The cause is the effect. You are rich because you are white because you are rich. This is why a Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue." Fanon's language of species difference is generally compatible with Winter's conception of divergent genres of human being that antagonize white beings' marshalling, of a universalized, violently monopolistic, genre-specific humanity, following Winter's feminist and diasporic black radical critique, while also echoing Jasbir Puar's and Ray Chow's queer materialist explications of the ascendancy of whiteness. I am interested in tracing how white beings' operationalized ascendancy is articulated across the grammars and vernaculars of race, civilization, nation, culture, religion, rationality, evolution, genetics, aesthetics, and economic development as foundational violence in the service of civilization's racial order, aka humanism. Winter's autobiographical account of confrontation with this order provides a useful point of departure for the critical analytical labor I am attempting to undertake in this book. Block quote, "It is not a matter of someone getting up and suddenly being racist. It is that given the conception of what it is to be human, to be an imperial English man or woman, you had to be seen by them as the negation of what they were. So you too had to circumcise yourself of yourself in order to be fully human." What a description. The condition of such intensive, intimate racial violence is white supremacy's mobilization as a social logic that assembles while coordinating an ensemble of juridical, cultural, economic, political, and militarized regimes. Here, white supremacy is conceptualized as a productive, creative, historical totality that exceeds its common political categorization as a far right-wing ideology. In fact, white supremacy coheres the fields of politics and culture in and of themselves. In such a conceptual and analytical context, White Reconstruction cannot be defined as a form of social equilibrium or hegemony. Rather, it is best analyzed as a historically specific, relatively coherent coalescence of efforts to achieve a condition of hegemony. The most recent and current expression of White Reconstruction entails the internally contested rearticulations and coordinations of juridical, cultural, economic, political, and policing domestic warfare apparati that attempt to address the potentially explosive contradictions between the official dismantling of apartheid segregation and its de facto persistence as a logic of carceral social ordering, while sustaining the national and global logics of the U.S. social political form as a racial chattel settler colonial order. At stake in this historically specific struggle for hegemony is the production, refurbishing, and/or reorganization of political alliances, gendered racial statecraft, common cultural sense, and social identities, convened as historical blocks in the language of Antonio Gramsci, For the sake of defending and sustaining white beings' ascendancy in the face of the unsustainability and structural obsolescence of classical, rigidly exclusionary, apartheid-based white supremacy. Stuart Hall crystallizes the classical conception of hegemony in his 1986 essay, Gramsci's Relevance for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. Hegemony is a very particular historically specific and temporary moment in the life of a society. It is quite rare for this degree of unity to be achieved, enabling a society to set itself quite new historical agenda, under the leadership of specific formation or constellation of social forces. There is nothing automatic about them. They have to be actively constructed and positively maintained. Crises mark the beginning of the disintegration. We must take note of the multidimensional, multi-arena character of hegemony. It cannot be constructed or sustained on one front of struggle alone, for example, the economic. It represents a degree of mastery over a whole series of different positions at once. On the one hand, the juridical dismantling of American apartheid prefaces a sustained and even epical crisis in the gendered racial ordering of the United States. Echoing Hall's definition, the disestablishment of formalized white institutional monopoly in various social, political, and economic fields disrupts the terms of a historical white supremacist unity that has been convened around and through apartheid racial power, including state-sanctioned civil violence. Militarized and legally enforced white geographic, economic, and social entitlements, and a formally segregated racist state. On the other hand, this momentous shift is not best characterized as a crisis of disintegrating hegemony. If hegemony is defined as the winning of consent and the taking into account of subordinate interests within a broader attempt by the aspirational hegemonic bloc to make itself popular. Hall reads Gramsci's conception of hegemony as a form of social power and civil order in which there is no pure case of coercion or consent, only different combinations of the two dimensions, in which the formation of effective consensual rule encompasses the critical domains of cultural, moral, ethical, and intellectual leadership. Complicating and confounding any such conceptions of hegemony, however, are the historical continuities of different peoples' asymmetrical subjection to the anti-black racial colonial violences of a political and national cultural modernity that consistently relies on imminent, threatened, and normalized exercises of coercive state power as the primary methods for establishing the preconditions for economic development, as well as an aspirational social and political order. Within these temporary and geographically overlapping genealogies of asymmetrical violence, the notion of consensus is a fundamental fraud. Domestic and hemispheric war, as an expression of anti-blackness and racial colonial power, is the overwhelming, if not exclusive, modality of rule over people whose access to the entitlements of citizenship, property, recognized political subjectivity, and even humanity itself is variously marginal, obstructed, disrupted, or simply non-existent. By way of paradigmatic example, the construction of Jim Crow apartheid in the emergence of U.S. modernity can only be apprehended as the establishment of a non-hegemonic social order due to its reliance on a totality of legally legitimated and culturally sanctioned gendered anti-black violence, disenfranchisement, carceral displacement, state terror as its primary method of order and sociality. Such a form of rule did not consider African-descended people to be proper subjects of consent and contingently categorized other racially marked and colonially displaced occupied peoples, indigenous and aboriginal peoples, Mexicans, Filipinos, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, and so on, as variably marginal or fundamentally alienated from white American modernity's fabricated domains of culture, morality, ethics, and intellectuality. As such, the presumed constituencies of white leadership were structured in complex relations of cultural and juridical racial colonial subjection and ontological anti-blackness. Under the modern U.S. apartheid order, black people were the subjects of non-hegemonic coercion via an ensemble of protocols and institutionalized practices of direct physiological, spiritual, and discursive evisceration that extinguished any context or possibility for hegemonic consent. Juridical, religious, scientific degradations and nullifications of being, state-condoned sexual assault, mob violence, lynching, and other forms of systemic state and civil violence constituted the ruling apparatus of post-emancipation, anti-black segregation, and, alongside other historically overlapping regimes of dominance, sustained the dynamic historical conditions of anti-black racial colonial domestic war. Given the various genealogies and long historical continuities of coercive power that persistently puncture and disrupt the possibilities for constructing consensual relations of state authority and popular consent to a modern social order, including but not limited to land displacement and conquest, settler colonial occupation, ecological and cultural genocide, chattel enslavement, illegal non-personhood, and violently enforced gender normativity. The consensual basis of hegemony has always been overwhelmingly reserved for the geographies, publics, and privileged collective subjectivities of white being, including non-citizen, immigrant, and even undocumented white Europeans. As a modern liberal iteration of settler colonial society that reproduces foundational relations of genocidal land, cultural, and ecological conquest, White Reconstruction presumes the militarized occupation of indigenous geographies and consistent political compartmentalization and or disavowal of a distended colonial sociality. Trask's enduring diagnosis of the New World Order remains as incisive as it is succinct. Unremittingly, the history of the modern period is the history of increasing conformity, paid for in genocide and ecocide. The more we are made to be the same, the more the environment we inhabit becomes the same. Quote, backward people forced into a, quote, modern, red industrial context that can no longer care for their environment. As the people are transformed or more likely exterminated, their environment is progressively degraded, parts of it is destroyed forever. Physical despoliation is reflected in cultural degradation. A dead land is preceded by a dying people. The secrets of the land die with the people of the land. This is the bitter lesson of the modern age. Forcing human groups to be alike results in the destruction of languages, of environments, of nations. Trask, Winter, and Fanon enmesh, enrich, and radically recontextualize Hall's critical interpretation of hegemony by focusing on the eruptions and interruptions of white Western modernity's alleged transition to non-coercive rule. These thinkers demand an ongoing confrontation with the modern New World Order as a condition of perpetual, dynamic, anti-black, and racial colonial violence. Among others cited throughout this book, Trask, Winter, and Fanon collectively demonstrate how any working conception of U.S. hegemony tacitly presumes the fundamentally non-consensual power of conquest. Chattel, anti-blackness, and racial colonial war as the conditions of possibility for modern power, sociality, and politicality, analyzed alongside the ongoing formation of the United States within the resilient global manifest destiny mandates of white settler conquest, there is little conceptual room to consider the apartheid racial colonial U.S. order as a hegemonic order at all. That is, unless the notion of hegemony is explicitly defined as a racially provincialized relation of consent that has generally been reserved for social political intercourse among non-enslaved, non-segregated, non-colonized, free, as in non-incarcerated, white social subjects, and their non-white colonized correlates, surrogates, and designees. multiculturalist white supremacy. Jody Melamed's Represent and Destroy plumbs the tension within critical conceptualizations of U.S. racial colonial power, tracing the serial racial formations of a formerly anti-racist liberal capitalist modernity that emerged as a white supremacy gradually became residual after World War II. Following the movements of racial hegemony from racial liberalism, 1940s to 60s, and liberal multiculturalism, 1980s to 1990s, to neoliberal multiculturalism, the 2000s, Melamed argues that these serial cultural political institutionalizations have cohered U.S. sociality since the mid-20th century as unifying discourses for U.S. state, society, and global ascendancy, and as material forces for post-war global capitalist expansion. Her discursive historical framework offers a helpful corrective to the subtly misleading periodizations of racial formation presented by Michael Omi and Howard Winant in their classic text Racial Formation in the United States, 1986, as well as Winant's subsequent work including The World as a Ghetto and The New Politics of Race, 2001 and 2004 respectively. Melamed explicitly parts ways with Winant when she contends that the racial break of the post-World War II years marked the onset of an authentically new relation of global racial power. Although I agree with Winant that the racial projects of white supremacy, this is a block quote from Melamed. Although I agree with Winant that the racial projects of white supremacist modernity have continued after the racial break, I argue that the break itself instantiated a new worldwide racial project that complexly supplemented and displaced its predecessor. A formally anti-racist, liberal capitalist modernity articulated under conditions of U.S. global ascendancy. I theorize the racial break as complete in the sense that its contradictions and tensions have given rise to this new worldwide racial project that revises, partners with, and exceeds the capacities of white supremacy without replacing or ending it. Under the conditions of this global rupture in racial power formations, formal or official anti-racism leaps into prominence as a non-redistributive discourse that is continuously, dynamically absorbed into the differential, intertwined, and generally symbiotic institutional structures and sociopolitical relations produced and otherwise impacted by the U.S. state in the apparati of global capitalism. Resonating with the work of Dean Spade, Nicholas Mitchell, Roderick Ferguson, and other critical theorists of gendered, sexual, and racial normativities within academic, juridical, and other contemporary institutional formations, Melamed proposes that official anti-racisms, another block quote, official anti-racisms, the freedoms they have guaranteed, the state capacities they have invented, the subjects they have recognized, and even the rights they have secured, have enabled the normalizing violences of political and economic modernity to advance and expand. By conceptualizing racial liberalism as a mode of normative power that decisively sutured an official anti-racism to U.S. governmentality, end quote, Melamed constructs a dynamic framework through which to analyze shifts in the texture of hegemonic racial power via the post-Jim Crow racial state and the emergent neoliberal capitalism. In this context, she argues that the shift from racial liberalism to liberal multiculturalism in the 1980s was catalyzed by a central ideological political contradiction shaping the late Cold War globality of the United States and adjoined regimes of transnational capitalism. Official anti-racist discourse had to take U.S. ascendancy for granted and remain blind to the inequalities of global capitalism, despite its racial organization, end quote. Melamed illustrates how, by subsuming the already structured and conceptually delimited egalitarian aspirations of racial liberalism to the commodifying tenets of liberal multiculturalism, The U.S. racial order was defined in the last 2 decades of the 20th century by, quote, a pluralist framework that took for granted the primacy of individual and property rights at the cost of collective and substantive social rights, end quote. Jody Kim further extends this genealogy by conceptualizing the Cold War as, quote, not only a historical period, but also an epistemology and production of knowledge, end quote. Clarifying how the particular version of racial pluralism that emerged in the 1980s produced a discursive and material militarizations against perceived and fabricated threats to, quote, individual and property rights, end quote. These, in turn, further activated the policing, carceral, and punitive juridical apparati of the gendered racist state in ways that indelibly marked the field of racial power. The most recent and concurrent racial formations, Melamed goes on to argue, is that of neoliberal multiculturalism, which defines prior liberal notions of normative, and therefore commodified and constrictive, quote, anti-racist equality, by averting reference to, quote, concrete human groups, and instead coding multicultural formalism as, quote, an economic order of things. Crucially, she suggests that these sequential racial formations have, quote, signaled white supremacy's partial deactivation, as liberal to neoliberal racial power has generally displaced direct relations of white racial domination in the mutually reinforcing domains of statecraft, jurisprudence, and civil society. Her study provides an extended cultural materialist analysis of the institutional transformations and discursive rearticulations of racist state and state-sanctioned violence under the aegis of official anti-racism, emblematized in the rise of the post-apartheid U.S. racial state. In so doing, Melamed's work provides a sound theoretical basis for critical examination of gendered racial colonial power in its complex historical continuities. That is, as a form of rule, militarization, jurisprudence, cultural production, institutionality, and modern liberal statecraft that exceed historically compartmentalized conceptions of racial and racial colonial domination. The latter tendency is exemplified in Omi and Winant's now canonical periodization of the post-World War II era as, quote, a transition from racial despotism to racial democracy, from domination to hegemony. In this transition, hegemonic forms of racial rule, those based on consent, eventually came to supplant those based on coercion, end quote. While the authors qualify their periodization by conceding that, quote, by no means has the United States established racial democracy in the 21st century, and by no means is coercion a thing of the past, end quote, they nonetheless insist that hegemony is a useful and appropriate term with which to characterize contemporary racial rule, end quote. While the preceding section of this introduction questions the adequacy of the hegemony concept to addressing the continuous durable violences of anti-blackness and racial colonial power in the modern period, I will elaborate this schematic critique by way of a collegial departure from Melamed's as well as Omi and Winant's book here. In my view, Melamed's analytical and narrative reframing of the post-World War II racial break invites a closer reading of white supremacy's dynamic presence, that is, its continuities, as a logic of power and violence that is shaped by racial colonial power and anti-blackness generally, including and especially in white supremacy's liberal and officially anti-racist forms. While my approach in this book subtly differs from Melamed's in its conceptualizations of white supremacy as a logic of dominance that constitutively exceeds particular state, economic, and or social forms, animated by, quote, a hollow ideology of force used to dominate non-whites and appropriate global resources. I am in agreement with her contention that serial racial formations have, perhaps temporarily, decentered official white supremacy as the primary discursive expression of post-World War II global racial modernity. The question I raise here is whether and how white supremacy continues, and continuous violences define, rather than recede from the socialities, institutions, cultural logics, and statecraft of what Melamed names as the periods of liberal and neoliberal multiculturalism, that is, the 80s to the 2000s. Manning Marable's race reform and rebellion creates productive conceptual and theoretical friction with Melamed's historicization of hegemonic racial liberalisms. Examining the complex legacies and internal contradictions of U.S.-based black freedom struggle in the post-World War II period, the Second Reconstruction. Marable develops the study through a historical critique of 20th century black liberationist, anti-apartheid, and anti-racist political movement, suggesting that, block quote, a third reconstruction at some future point is historically probable, given the gross structural failures of the Second Reconstruction to abolish permanently high rates of unemployment for blacks, Latinos, and low-income whites, or to resolve the dire conditions of poor health care, inferior public schools, and urban decay which plague all national minorities and millions of white Americans. Moving from a critique of how the prime beneficiary of the gains from the Second Reconstruction was the black elite, Marable devotes much of the book's penultimate chapter to a detailed account of the layered forces of reaction, repression, and resurgent conservatism that assembled in response to the limited political, legislative, electoral, and cultural victories of the movement that overthrew U.S. apartheid. Marable's text demonstrates that while white supremacy's primary institutional expressions may have substantially shifted during this period, it did not significantly recede from U.S. social life during the post-World War II or post-1960s era. In fact, Marable's study reveals the creep and spread of anti-black reactionary elements across the institutions, cultural structures, and political discourses of state and civil society, illustrating how they both cultivated and infiltrated an ensemble of forces that attacked the legacies of the Second Reconstruction. For Marable, the Carter and Reagan presidential administrations were conjoined in their rollback of the economic, educational, and legislative gains secured by the black freedom struggle. He further documents the expansion of white supremacist organizations and organized anti-black violence across the United States throughout the 70s. Evidencing how such violence included, but was not limited to, militia-type warfare against progressive black organizations, assassinations of black political leaders, mass white supremacist rallies, periodically successful and always politically impactful electoral campaigns by self-identified white supremacist candidates, white supremacist infiltrations of local police forces, and widespread legally sanctioned police torture and killing of black civilians. The book further outlines how COINTELPRO-type repression of black radicals, revolutionary nationalists, and Marxists also resurfaced during these years, while paying special attention to increased occurrences of the most prevalent form of American racist violence: lynchings, hangings, castrations, shootings, and other acts of racially motivated random violence. White Reconstruction lingers in the narrative theoretical tension between Melamed's genealogy of racial liberalism / liberal multiculturalism / neoliberal multiculturalism and Marable's tracing of the Second Reconstruction and its aftermath. Following Marable, the Second Reconstruction, when apprehended alongside the global surge of black liberationists, indigenous and third world global south anti-colonial self-determination, anti-capitalist, feminist, and radically democratic movements throughout the middle decades of the 20th century, forms the extended cultural political context for a resurgent white supremacist reaction that has generally articulated with, while periodically differentiating itself from the ensembles of post-World War II liberal racial modernity. This book frames the overlapping, intertwined resurgences, rearticulations, and reforms of gendered white supremacy, anti-blackness, and racial colonial power within a particular period of white reconstruction that continues to unfold in critical tension with the ensembles of liberal multiculturalism and neoliberal multiculturalism alike. Here and in Chapter 1, I introduce and elaborate multiculturalist white supremacy as a distinguishing technology of white reconstruction that emerges through the discursive regimes and institutional rearticulations of liberal and neoliberal multiculturalism. The notions of multiculturalist white supremacy indexes how the logics, protocols, and compulsory normativities and gendered racial violence of hegemonic institutions and of the anti-black racial colonial social formation generally become increasingly capacious, flexible, and promiscuously inclusive as monopoly-based systems of racial dominance. For example, apartheid, Jim Crow, and other versions of classical white supremacy are abolished and displaced in the name of liberal, teleological, national to global racial progress. Within the mobilizations and institutional technologies of multiculturalist white supremacy, the diverse social subjects, who are also the commodified demographics objects of these conditions of capaciousness, flexibility, and promiscuous inclusivity, are solicited as living evidence of a liberal modern racial telos. They, in turn, inhabit the paradigms, methods, and relations of power that constitute the foundational violence of white being, including, but not limited to, its conquest, colonial, racial chattel, and neoliberal imperial distensions. All right, well, that's it for this section. When we resume, we will pick up on page 17 with the section titled Critical Methods for, quote, the Millennium of Man. Thanks.